All right, everybody, welcome to the number one TV show in the history of the world and the universe, and most specifically, the number one TV show in Alaska. So, I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon and The Blackest Heart, both books published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. And today I am reviewing the book Alaska by James Michener. Now, this, if you followed my channel for any length of time, you know that this is one of my top 5 favorite books of all time. And so it was a joy to reread it. And I reread it over the course of about a month. It's a big book, 1,200 pages or so. And but I was just reading like about 50 pages a day for the span of a little while as I was reading other books. But anyway, I loved rereading this. Came out in 1988, and I've got several copies here. I've got a first edition hardcover. I've got this paperback and this mass market paperback. So I've got 3 versions. I like the yellow end paper. I like when they used to paint all the end papers bright yellow like that. I think that's cool. I mean, isn't it just cooler than, I just think that's dope. I wish more publishers would still do that. Anyway, let me see. So this is an original paperback that came out in the 80s. This is the more modern version paperback you can get now. So let's discuss the covers first, because you know I love cover illustration and graphic design. I think I like both of them okay. I think I'm going to go with the original 1980s one. I just think it looks kind of cool. And of course, the hardcover is dope as well. But anyway, we will put several of them back. I will put these 2 back here, and we'll hold this one up for the remainder of the video and review. It's got, okay, so there's a ton of maps in here too. There's a ton of maps, of various maps of Alaska and different parts of Alaska. So through the story, you're going to always be grounded in the places that the story is taking place. If you just look at the map. Now, I grew up in Alaska. That's one of the reasons this is one of my favorite books of all time. I have a fondness for Alaska. I visit it now and then, still to this day, even though I don't live there anymore. But I feel like I'm an Alaskan. I mean, and I spent about 12 years there, so I think that I would qualify as a true Alaskan with the amount of time I spent there. And as I review this book, because this is going to be one of my more longer reviews, just so you know, because this book has a lot of stuff in it. As I review this book, I'm going to tell some personal stories of Alaska that I've got. So just keep in mind, you will be getting that. So what is Alaska about? Well, it's about the history of Alaska, told through a lot of different short stories that James Michener has put in here. And it starts from the formation of the Alaskan continent. I mean, and it goes all the way till 1988, the history. So, the first story he tells is called The Clashing Terrains. And it's basically 30 or 40 pages of just how Mother Nature, tens and thousands and hundreds of thousands years ago, formed the landmass that is Alaska. The clashing continents, the volcanoes, everything. And then we get another chapter called The Ice Castle, which is about the ice age of our planet and how glaciers and all this sort of stuff formed all the different land masses across the world. How surprisingly, Alaska was immune to a lot of that. I mean, the Ice Age, you think, but Alaska, not always was Alaska part of the Ice Age. And then it talks about the migration of different creatures like the mastodon, the muskox, the saber-toothed lion lived up there, big, huge beavers, and even camels used to live and thrive in Alaska. And then another chapter called People of the North, where we get 29,000 years ago. We talk about man, how man migrated into Alaska, and how it was man versus the woolly mammoths, how they started to build things like kayaks, how they started to hunt whales. And I mean, some of the dramatic scenes of the whale hunts where just one lone man would go out in a little kayak and a spear and a rope, kill a whale in the ocean. So, I mean, he paddled himself so far from land, he couldn't even see land anymore. He'd kill a whale with his spear, tie the whale up to his kayak, and paddle back to shore hundreds of miles with a whale tied to his kayak to feed his village. Holy shit. This, my friends, was when men were men. I could never go out into the ocean in a kayak and kill myself a whale and paddle my ass back to shore with a whale tied to my kayak. I mean, it just seems impossible. But this is what they did. Like I said, us men today, we are hella and lame. And thank God we don't have to do any of that shit just to feed our village. Oh my Lord, I can just go to a buffet down the street from my house and get way better food than whale blubber. But, you know, it's not my fault that I was born when I was born. But I'm just amazed. This is why this book is so amazing. And that's why most of all of James Michener's books are so amazing, because he shows you what humanity had to go through in its history just to survive, just to keep babies being born and generation after generation after generation. It's a miracle that any of us are even here. Because, just the amount of danger people used to put them through. Anyway, then we get in a chapter called The Explorers. It jumps from the year 29,000 to 1723, so it makes a big time jump. And then we get The Explorers, and it starts in Russia. This big chunk of the book starts in Russia with Peter the Great and how he sends a fellow named Bering. He's like, hey, we've heard of this mythical land over here, which at the time it wasn't named Alaska. There was just this place. Well, we want you to go explore it. So he sent this guy named Bering from St. Petersburg all the way across Russia, 6,000 miles across Russia, to go explore that land that is Alaska. And he does it. And I mean, that's where we get the name Bering Strait and the Bering Sea. It's from this Russian guy, Bering, who explored it. Not only did he explore it, but he explored it and went back to St. Petersburg and then back and explored and back and explored. I mean, he did the trip multiple times in his life. That's the way it was, Lewis and Clark. This guy Bering, I mean, oh my God, I'm just in awe of these people. This book is just amazing. History, I mean, the history you can learn about our world, not just Alaska, but of Russia and everything is combined in our world, and it all revolves around this great story that is Alaska. So then we get a chapter called The Duel, which takes place in about 1789. And this is kind of like about sort of how earthquakes and volcanoes and tidal waves, things like that, kind of shaped Alaska, and how when Bering and Christianity was sort of introduced to the native Alaskans, who were kind of like shaman type peoples, like shamanism. It was like this conflict between shamanism and Christianity. And then in 1804, so The Duel and the story called Lost Worlds are kind of connected with the same characters, and we get a lot of history about Sitka and the Tlingit Indians and the various other explorers, like Russian people that explored inner Alaska, that went along the Yukon. They went overland. They explored the mountain ranges. And then in 1867, Alaska was sold by the Russians to America. And then once that happened, we get a chapter called Giants in Chaos, which is about how once Russia gave up control of Alaska to the United States, that the place just devolved into chaos, lawlessness for a lot of years, from 1804 almost to 60 years. It was about 1867 to I can't remember. It was a lot of years until about 1890s, in about the 1890s, when gold was discovered in Alaska. The place was lawless. It just had nobody watching over it. I mean, it was just chaos, pure chaos. and it fell into disrepair. It was just a wasteland of cold, harsh. Nobody really wanted to be there. And then gold was discovered, and then suddenly everyone wanted a piece of Alaska. And then we had the Klondike Gold Rush, and we get story after story of different people in that Klondike Gold Rush seeking their fortune. Skagway, all of that stuff, the trails that they blazed through the mountains. And then we get the Golden Beaches of Nome. So there's a chapter called The Giants in Chaos, which is about the decay of Alaska. Then a chapter called Gold, which is 100 pages or more of just the Klondike Gold Rush. And then we get the Golden Beaches of Nome, which is takes place around 1900, and it's more about the gold rush in different parts of Alaska. And then also in the 1900s, we get the early 1900s, there's a big couple 100-page story called Salmon, about salmon and the wildlife of Alaska, and how the salmon of the Copper River and things like that, now when I lived in Alaska, we lived in Fairbanks, but we used to go down to the Copper River to catch salmon. Now, back in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid doing this, if you were an Alaskan native, you could catch as many salmon as you wanted, however you wanted. Didn't matter. They didn't give a shit. Now, if you were a visitor to Alaska and you got yourself a visitor fishing permit, you had to fish the old fish-fashion way with a fishing pole, and you could just catch one salmon at a time with your whatever you could fish with your fishing pole, which is hard. Now, since we were native Alaskans, we would just go to the Copper River with these big dip nets, and we would just scoop the salmon out the river by the dozens, because they're so thick in the rivers. You could just literally, on the Copper River, you could literally just tie yourself. Well, you'd have to tie yourself. The Copper River is the gnarliest river in the world. I mean, it is the most dangerous river you're ever going to see. It scared the out of me as a kid. And even watching videos of it now and people fishing on it now scares the crap out of me. You actually have to tie yourself to the shore. You have to tie yourself to a tree or something, because if you get near this river, it will suck you in, and there's so much silt and it's going so fast that it will just pull you to the bottom. There's so many whirlpools and bubbling water, and it's moving so quickly over so many rocky terrain. It's just a badass river. But the salmon swim up this river in the hundreds of thousands. And you'd tie yourself to a tree, and you'd get as close to the shore, close to the river as you dared, which I mean was right at the river's edge. And you would dip your net into this river, and you would just throw the salmon up over by the dozen. We would catch so many salmon in a day that we would line the salmon up on our front lawn, and it would cover our entire front lawn and our neighbor's entire front lawn just with the salmon that we'd lined up. Anyway, that's how. But I love the salmon stories here in this. And anyway, we move on to the railroad, where we get the transportation starting to be built through inner Alaska, the railroads and things like that. And then the Rim of Fire is our last story, which takes place between the 1969 and 1988. And that's more of about the modern day Alaska and how the Alaska pipeline and everything was, done. Oh my God, what an adventure. Every one of the stories that James Michener tells in this is just an adventure. He's a magnificent writer. His prose is on point. It's effortless writing, just great stories, great characters throughout. And you learn so much about the history of Alaska. And he's not just, and if you saw my James Michener book collection video, I've got like 15 of his books, and they're all this thick, and they all focus on a different part of the world, like Texas, the Caribbean, the Chesapeake Bay, Poland, Mexico, Hawaii, Colorado, Alaska, Israel, South Africa. I mean, he's done grand historical novel about all of those places and more. I didn't even mention all of them. Just absolutely fabulous. Alaska is one of my top 5 favorite books of all time. 10 out of 10. Absolutely worth reading.